Good evening, everyone. I'll just call this public meeting to order. And at this time, if I can have Councillors Bodner and Beauregard move the agenda. Are there any questions? All in favor? That's carried. The only disclosure I have is Councillor Beauregard with conflict of interest on item 4.2. Are there any further conflicts? Seeing none. So we have two statutory public meetings this evening. 4.1 is a public meeting report for proposed draft plan of condominium and zoning bylaw amendment at 690 700 Elm Street. And 4.2 is a public meeting report for proposed plan of subdivision and zoning bylaw amendment for Northland Estates. We do have a few written delegations, and we have some delegations that will be brought in virtually, and those that are in attendance this evening. So that list is already there. There was an amendment this afternoon with added names, so it should show up on your e-scribe. And Councillor Claylough is joining us this evening virtually, and Councillor Danch, who's in a BIA meeting, will be joining us when he's finished that. So this time I'm going to turn the first one over to Mr. Schultz.
Thank you, Mayor Steele. The presentation up here. Okay. The purpose of this meeting, pursuant to sections 34 and 51 of the Planning Act, is to consider a draft plan of condominium and zoning bylaw amendment application submitted by the applicant Curtis Thompson of Better Neighborhoods Inc. on behalf of the owner Topwide Property Development Inc. for the lands known as part of Lot 3, west side of Cranberry Street, part of blocks B and C on Plan 775. The zoning bylaw amendment proposes to amend zoning bylaw 6575/30/18 to rezone the subject lands from R4-CH, being R4 fourth density with the conversion holding, and R2 being second density residential, to a site-specific R4 zone that will permit a development of 71 total dwelling units, including 5 single-detached, 10 semi-detached, 15 townhouses, and 41 apartment dwelling units. The draft plan of condominium will implement the proposed zoning bylaw amendment and legally allow each unit to be held in independent ownership and establish common elements such as the internal condominium road. Notice of the public meeting was administered in accordance with sections 34 and 51 of the Planning Act as amended in Ontario Regulations 544/06 and 545/06. Notice of public meeting was circulated on August 31st, 2022 to internal departments and agencies, and notice was also circulated via regular mail to property owners within 120 meters on August 30th, 2022. Meeting details have been provided along with the council agenda on the city's website and under current applications. As of the date of this meeting, staff has received the following comments from commenting departments and agencies. From the city's drainage superintendent, no objection to the proposed application and no concerns with respect to municipal drains. From the Bylaw Enforcement Division, no adverse comments at this time. From the Fire Department, no concerns at this time. From the District School Board of Niagara, no objections to the application. Future students from this area would attend McKay Public School from JK to grade 8 and Port Colborne High School from grade 9 to 12. From Enbridge, no objection to the proposed application. However, Enbridge reserves the right to amend or remove development conditions. No objection, from Hydro One, no comments or concerns at this time. And from the Niagara Region, Regional Planning and Development Services staff does not object to the zoning bylaw amendment and draft plan of condominium applications in principle, as the proposed redevelopment is consistent with the provincial policy statement and conforms to provincial and regional growth management policies, subject to the conditions attached in their comment letter. From the city's engineering department, engineering staff have provided a number of technical comments to the applicant. It is expected that the majority of the comments will be able to be addressed either prior to council's consideration of the draft plan and zoning bylaw amendment or through a future site plan control application. Additionally, staff has received the following comment from a member of the public, Jennifer Winfrey of 62 George Street. Jennifer is in support of the development as a whole, as it is a good use of vacant land to increase housing. Jennifer does have concerns surrounding parking and its overflow onto adjoining streets, and notes that many children in the area walk to the park. Jennifer would like to request that a 2 to 3 hour parking limit be implemented at the park and there be no parking within 10 meters of the intersection at George and Elm. The procedure to be followed this evening will be to present Development and Legislative Services Report, Department 2022-213, pass the meeting over to the applicant to provide a presentation, hear any comments or questions of clarification from council to the applicant or planning staff, open the meeting to the public for comments, and announce the requirements under the Planning Act for written notice of passage of the proposed draft plan of condominium and zoning bylaw amendment. At this time, I would like to present Development and Legislative Services Public Hearing Report 2022-213. Next slide, please. The area surrounding the subject lands are predominantly low-density residential uses. The surrounding zoning varies from R2 to institutional and R4 across the street. Next slide, please. The City of Port Colborne official plan designates the subject property as urban residential. Land uses in the urban residential designation include residential, neighborhood commercial, and community facilities, and institutional uses. Residential uses, such as the proposed development, is permitted in the urban residential designation, and the official plan is not proposed to be changed as a result of this application. The application will be evaluated against policies surrounding infill and intensification, as well as the general policies of the urban residential designation. Next slide, please. The subject property currently has 2 zones assigned to it, one of which being the R4CH, which is the 4th density residential zone with conversion holding, and the other zoning being R2. The R4CH zone permits detached dwellings, duplexes, semi-detached dwellings, triplexes, fourplexes, townhouses, and apartment buildings. And the R2 zone permits detached dwellings, semi-detached dwellings, and duplexes. The conversion holding aspect of the R4 zoning refers to the requirement of filing a record of site condition prior to the ability of the holding provision to be lifted. The applicant has successfully filed a record of site condition with the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, and a site-specific R4 zone with the CH removed is proposed for the entirety of the lands through this application. Some key changes include, if we can go to the next slide, please. Revisions to the accessory dwelling unit provisions to set a maximum unit size and building height, and revisions to the home-based business provisions, deletion of section 2.12 referring to buildings on one lot, revisions to the permitted encroachment provisions, revisions to ingress and egress provisions to reduce the minimum 2-way driveway width, and revisions to the R4 zoning requirements to reflect the proposed condominium configuration. Next slide, please. The proposed draft plan of condominium will establish the internal private road network and common elements to be held in condominium ownership. As mentioned previously, a total of 71 units are proposed, 41 of which being apartment units, 15 townhouse units, 10 semi-detached units, and 5 single-detached units. Should these applications be approved, a future site plan control process will follow to address site features such as walkways, landscaping, servicing, drainage, lighting, fencing, and parking areas. At this time, Your Worship, I'd like to pass the floor to the applicant, Curtis Thompson, for a brief presentation.
Great, thanks, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Thompson?
Good evening, council and public. My name is Curtis Thompson. I'm a registered professional planner with Better Neighborhoods Consulting out of St. Catharines. I do have a slide deck. Thanks. You could start at the next slide. I'll try not to cover what David with planning staff has already gone over. The subject lands is surrounded by a mix of residential uses, notably a lot of single detached houses, church, parkland, and some multi-unit residential. It's located in a quite walkable neighborhood. It's really close to the Main Street West commercial area. It's around 1.5 kilometers to the main downtown area near Clarence and King. So it's got good access to parks, schools, public service facilities, and a lot of essential amenities. Next slide, please. As David mentioned, 71 dwelling units are proposed in a vacant land condominium ownership arrangement, wherein there'd be a private street, private lanes, and private sidewalks that would be held under common ownership of the condominium corporation. So the municipality, it's not proposed that the municipality would take ownership of this infrastructure. There's an existing house at 690 Elm Street, which would be subject to demolition in the southeast corner of the site. And one of the main purposes of the zoning amendment being requested, which I'll go into in a bit, is to lift the holding zone, which was put in place to deal with environmental remediation, and to amend a number of performance standards for the buildings that are proposed on the site. Next slide, please. So in September of last year, we voluntarily held a open house and invited the neighbors adjacent to the property. And at the time, the property was a little bit smaller in size, and the site plan is shown on the slide deck here. And we had some very productive discussions and got good feedback from the public. Next slide, please. Among the feedback we heard, we had a smaller apartment building internal of the site. There was a lot of pushback about that apartment building, that it was too close to the existing houses. There were some broad concerns regarding drainage, privacy, rodents, noise, traffic, parking, among other things. It was also suggested that we look at a public storage facility as a use of the property. We did hear some positive feedback about the location of some of the houses on the site with backyards against backyards. Next slide, please. So what resulted from that exercise, the owners ended up acquiring one of the houses that was between the church, number 690, and as a result, the land area grew. We relocated the apartment building towards the street in respect of the feedback we heard. This increased the setbacks to the existing houses. It also improves the walkability of the neighborhood by helping frame the street, providing more population towards the commercial area where it matters. We also increased the housing units and scale of that apartment building as a result of the land acquisition. And where the apartment building once was sitting, there's now a rear laneway that loops around that actually helps provide an additional buffer to the existing houses to the south. In a rear laneway configuration, it's as good as the spatial separation would get. Next slide, please. The Port Colborne official plan has a lot of really good policies in it. It sets a good framework for how the outlook for the city is planned to evolve. Among those is strong encouragement to promote compact infill development that respects the existing character of the neighborhood, and with good attention to providing a mix of housing along the residential housing continuum. And we believe the proposed development more than addresses this. Next slide, please. As city planning staff has mentioned, the property currently has split zoning, R2 being for the two existing houses that once stood in the southeast corner of the site. The entitlement of the property for the R4 zone is largely being adhered to with the exception of a few provisions, but one of the triggers for that zoning amendment was to lift the holding provision for the environmental remediation. The provisions range from some lot geometry specs, driveway and encroachment modifications, and shortening the front yard setbacks to bring the houses close to the street, as one of the underlying design intents of this development was to employ some traditional neighborhood and new urbanist development characteristics, so buildings close to the street with prominent front entries and porches to help enhance the public realm. Next slide, please. This is the site plan and the 4 or 5 building types that we've got proposed, ranging from singles, semis, front and rear loaded, townhouses, and a mixed-use apartment building. Next slide, please. I'm just going to take you through quickly each of the building forms, and just to note that these are conceptual at this point. The apartment building would be a 5.5-story mixed-use building with around 1,000 square foot commercial presence at the Elm Street sidewalk. The use is permitted, it complies with the height, and it complies with the parking provisions. In fact, the entire proposal complies with the parking provisions. Next slide, please. There's a block of 5 townhouses on Elm Street that are proposed. As part of the zoning provisions, accessory dwellings are already permitted broadly across the city, but these have been designed in a way where the main floor has the option of being a small apartment, and the main unit would be in the upper floors. Alternatively, the main floor could also operate as a home-based business, which again is a default zoning provision. One of the requests that we've made is to liberalize some of the provisions just so they can put some signage. And we were very precise in that this only applies to this block of townhouses because it's on a busy arterial road. It's an extension of the Main Street West downtown area. So that was very intentional. But everything else internal would be bound by the default home-based business provisions. And a theme in keeping with the rest of the built housing that we've designed is that the attached housing is representative of individuality by unit type. So it's not looking like one large building, but we've tried to break it up by unit using horizontal vertical transitions in the architectural design. Next slide, please. There's 2 other blocks of townhouses internal of the site facing a little parquet greenway with the sidewalk and landscaping. These are conceptual as well, but as you can see, it follows similar design principles. Next slide, please. We've got 2 types of semi-detached, front-loaded and rear-loaded being on the left in this illustration. The rear laneway improves the streetscape by eliminating driveway aprons and reducing conflict points between vehicles and pedestrians. It also helps enliven the street edge by allowing for more glazing, doors, front porches, and interaction between neighbors. So it's a time-tested principle of a traditional neighborhood development. Next slide, please. We've also got 3 designers that are working with the owners, and that was intentional to try and break up the architectural design so it doesn't look like it was built all by one person. And the owners are experimenting with trying to do more modern, contemporary development along with some traditional design principles and authentic architectural principles being adhered to. Next slide, please. Pending the outcome of the zoning, we'd be looking to apply for a site plan approval. As part of that, we have been working with staff in looking to implement a neighborhood design code or an architectural guideline document that would accompany the agreement and help control the exterior built form of the houses. And this is intentional as it would help reduce costs and delays down the road if site plan amendments get triggered due to the typical arrangement where building plans get registered on title. So it's meant to provide some flexibility over the long term, but still satisfy the city's policies around urban design. Next slide, please. So in closing, this, in our opinion, represents a wonderful opportunity for the city. We know objectively how we've been planning and developing over the past half century hasn't been the most sustainable, healthy, or has been inequitable in many ways. We have vivid, clear policy direction from all levels of government, not only encouraging us to do better, but in other ways requiring us to do better. So we must plan for the future we would like and not for the past that we're experiencing. And I'm happy to answer any questions of council or the public. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Schultz?
Thanks, Curtis, for the presentation. Your Worship, are there any questions of clarification for myself or the applicant?
Okay. Council? Councilor Borgard.
Through your worship to the applicant, you spoke a little bit about the general provisions, in particular the home-based businesses and some of the amendments there. What is it that you are seeking to technically do with that? Sorry, let me clarify. How does the current general provisions around home-based businesses not meet the general proposal that you are proposing today? Why is it you need this amendment?
Mr. Thompson?
Through the chair. The home-based business amendments that we've are requesting was kind of a last minute thing, and they're quite minor. They mostly deal with opening up the signage provisions, whereas currently the home-based business, and this goes for almost any municipality, it's pretty restricted in that you can almost never have a sign because of the residential character and the need to preserve that feel. So being that it's on Elm Street and it's an extension of Main Street West, steps away from it, we figured this was not, and we're proposing a mixed-use building next door, we figured that opening up those provisions just so that it wouldn't be so hidden and stealthy, that it could actually operate as a live-work unit potentially, like maybe a small office or travel agency running in their main floor. Alternatively, it could also never be, and it could just continue as residential. That is the default setting that we started out with, but so those are basically the nature of the amendments. I believe the draft bylaw would have been circulated to council. Does that answer?
Through your worship, to the presenter again. My second question, so there's garages that are showing along lanes A, B, and C that they kind of get access through those lanes. Are those being set up to be accessory dwelling units by any chance on top of those garages? Or, yeah, I'll just let you explain.
Mr. Thompson?
Through the chair. Most of them, no. And there's zoning reasons why it's either not geometrically possible, there likely wouldn't be enough parking or dimensions to accommodate the parking. So there is a prospect for a couple of them to potentially be coach houses, which is a permitted use in the bylaw, subject to the other provisions being met. But largely, most of them won't. They'll just be garages or carports.
Councillor?
Just a follow-up to that. So you're seeking to amend the general provision around accessory dwelling units as well. So can you explain why you're requesting that amendment?
Mr. Thompson?
Through the chair, the only provisions that we're seeking changes to for the accessory dwelling units is changing how we limit the size of them. I believe, and David can, planning staff can confirm, but I believe right now it's restricted on a percentage of the principal unit. We're not huge fans of that because in our opinion, it conflicts with an Ontario regulation that talks about regulating relationships between the ADUs and the main house. So we like to stick with a flat number that ensures that it's secondary to the principal unit, that there is there's a possibility that there's a ceiling, that it can be more affordable in nature given its size constraints. And the only other provision we amended other than that one was increasing the height limit of them to 7.5 meters to allow for an actual 1.5 story or 2-story without a flat roof, basically.
Councillor?
Through your worship, to maybe David, do you have any comments regarding the accessory dwelling unit not being a percentage and being a strict number?
Schultz?
Through the mayor, staff hasn't really given an opinion on that yet, but I have noticed through my experience that the percentage aspect does, for example, if someone builds a, large 5,000 square foot home, that would allow for a very large accessory dwelling unit. So I can see the point made by the applicant here that in order to keep that unit affordable and able to keep the rent down, the size limit would help with that.
Okay, great, thanks, Councillor. I've got Councillor Bruno, then Councillor Wells.
Thank you, Worship, and thank you to the presenter. Appreciate the fact that I know the neighbors do for your firm having the pre-meeting privately to flush out some of the details. I see that you have amended it on the apartment building. Before I get into the list of questions I had, in your comments, and I don't think I quite caught it, so you mentioned, I think it was the one row of townhouses, I'm not sure if it was the ones with the home-based businesses is, where, again, correct me if I didn't catch this right, where the bottom floor or a floor could be used as an apartment?
Mr. Thompson?
Could you recant that with some more verbiage on it?
Through the chair, certainly. So the design intent for that block of townhouses was that because of their presence on the busier road close to downtown, that having short setbacks, that the accessory dwelling unit would make sense at grade if the owners opted for that in their purchase from the builder. They can't, we did a geotechnical study, and bedrock is very shallow there, which lends itself well actually to the apartment building, side note, just because of where the foundation would bear. But the ADU, if they do opt for it, could work in the main floor. Alternatively, they could run like a home occupation out of that main floor, or alternatively, neither of those, they could just have the whole house, basically just a regular house.
Counselor?
So if I could, so that doesn't increase the number of units in your proposal if they did that option?
Mr. Thompson?
Through the chair, so if an ADU permit was issued with the main unit, like an accessory dwelling unit was issued, a building permit with the main unit, then it would increase the units. However, there's the reason that we don't show ADUs, and almost every development proposal doesn't show ADUs, whether you're doing a subdivision, is because it's virtually impossible to predict how many actually get built. So, and often a lot of municipalities purposely write in their official plan that they don't calibrate density based off of ADUs, because it would be incredibly complicated and a moving target. So if there were ADUs, it would increase the unit yield, but they could go in, they can be removed at any point in the future, and also they would only actually be able to get building permits if the parking was provided for that unit. And there's not enough surplus parking on this property to allow for everyone to have accessory dwelling units. Just so council's aware, only a handful of them at best would be able to have accessory dwelling units.
Counselor?
I think that gets to the nub of what the increase would be. So that's only on the one set, correct, of townhouses. And what could that maximum then bump it to? So for every one in that unit, it could possibly be two?
Mr. Thompson?
Through the chair, that permission would extend to the other houses as well, and it's going to likely be a first come first serve. So we don't know exactly what that net difference would be for the surplus parking. It will depend on the uptake and how many of them opt for ADUs. Right now, we've got 130 plus parking stalls for 71 units. So some of those are allocated to the apartment building, the commercial unit in the apartment building, and then the balance of the housing. So in short, I can't give you the precise number. There is a surplus, but we would venture to guess maybe 10% of the units could have accessory dwelling units based off of similar trends in other municipalities.
Counselor?
Thank you. Through you, if I could, Mr. Mayor, to the planner. So David, that could potentially mean another 10 units. That has to out of 71? So that has to factor into water, wastewater, storm sewer, and parking, correct?
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, yes, that would be correct. That would be evaluated through the permitting process.
So can you, for the next report, come back with what that maximum would be? Because I think as a council and as residents there, we would want to know what the potential upside maximum would be. So you're going to have to do the parking calculation. But I think at the end of the day, I think the agent is quite right. There will be a limit to that. But I think we all deserve to know what that limit would be. So I would ask that that number be brought back, because whilst it might be 71 if no one opts for the other, it would be nice to know what the other number is, and if that indeed can be incorporated, water, wastewater, stormwater. So if we could have that possibly for the next meeting.
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, yes, we can work with the applicant to get that number established with their engineer.
Great, thank you. One of the questions that's been asked of me, and it may come up in the public group, but I'll ask it in case it doesn't. The 3-story to 6-story, you moved purchased the home 6-story. The 6-story is within the R4 being asked for. So those units. Those units will then have the corresponding parking, correct? Because as I understood it, there's not a need to do any variance on the parking. Okay, great, thank you. You mentioned the one of the changes was on heights, and I had thought there may not be any height issue changes, but that was for the towns and semis? No.
Mr. Thompson?
Through the chair, the only amendment being requested for height was for the accessory dwelling units that would be located in a garage. So
Okay.
accessory dwelling units.
Thank you. Yep. Another issue would be fencing. Does the developer propose to encompass the external boundaries with a fence?
Mr. Thompson?
Through the chair, the owners are prepared to provide a continuous fence through the site plan process.
Thank you. And so you are building the apartment building, but am I correct in assuming that the towns and semis are freehold, and are they owner-built, so you'll be selling the lots, or will you actually be constructing the homes in there?
Mr. Thompson?
Through the chair. So I'll try and explain the arrangement. So the owner group currently is working with the builder who is prepared to take on the build role in this capacity. However, I can't predict the future, so I also don't know if that builder is prepared to take on the apartment building. So once the vacant land condominium is established, it's different from a subdivision, but essentially it's selling a plot of land in that corporation, and the common elements
Right.
would be the private roads, the private lanes, in lieu of a public street.
Right?
They're like privately owned, semi-public, but in essence, they'd be operating freehold, or they're not quite fee simple lots in that sense. However, the apartment building right now would be a party. It would be a unit holder in this condo block. But because of the way the building is set up, a separate standard condominium approval would be required to allow for individual ownership of the apartments.
Yes.
So until such time as a separate application is made, that building could only be issued a permit under a rental arrangement,
Right.
basically.
So again, though, for the balance of the development, the singles, towns, semis, will you be selling those lots to an individual for them or their builder to build?
Mr. Thompson?
I get the difference, but I know it's the plan of vacant condominium, but the actual structures, if I walk in, I'm sure you're going to do the development in phases, is that fair to say? So where I'm trying to get at this is that every lot is going to have to comply to the overall drainage plan. But will that be but if individuals do that, you're going to have a whole bunch of onesie permits trying to comply. And I'm really concerned about how this rolls out. And so we've had some other development in town where, they've gone on for years because of vacant lots. And that's fine if that's what the market predicts. But I'd just like to know up front, because we've had a lot of problems with the vacant lot becoming a whole bylaw issue, both from the grading point of view, both from the spill from the house being built next door, all those kind of concerns. And so, obviously you can only build to market conditions, but I guess I'm still concerned, if you know, whether these are going to be like one at a time and two individuals.
Mr. Thompson?
Through the chair, just a couple questions to unpack there. So I believe to some degree it's going to be the capacity of the builder, like with the way the market is, notwithstanding the slump we're in now. They can only pump out so many at a time. It would be phased. I imagine the apartment building would like to be the last thing to go. And in terms of like the handling the grading and drainage and how that would roll out, the first thing that would happen post-site plan approval is the primary services would go in, so the actual road network and the underground infrastructure and the catch basin. So the first thing that's going to happen is the storm network would go in.
Yep.
And a number of the catch basins that we have proposed are actually mostly picking up the neighbors based on the existing overland flow route. So that would be the first thing that happens before any building permits get issued. And David may be able, planning staff would be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe once individual permits go in for application through the building department, they have to adhere to the master grading plan and drainage plan from the site plan, which is on title, on an individual level. So that must be true for the permit to be issued, and closing issued as well for the permit.
Mr. Schultz? Thanks. Do you want to just clarify that for council?
Through the mayor, yes, that would be correct.
Great, thank you. Councilor Wells?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just for a point of clarification, through you to the planner, to David, the amendments that are proposed for the home-based business, they basically apply to the units 1 through 5 on Elm Street. And those amendments that are in there allow the use or the home business to be the primary use. And they also allow the number of clients to be increased, which would mean possible parking increases in that area. So am I incorrect in that interpretation that those 5 units could become commercial units rather than dwelling units?
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, that is a good point. Staff will be reviewing that through the recommendation report process. We'll take a careful look at that to ensure that that's not the case. We want these home-based business uses to be secondary to the main use. So we'll need to take a look at that through the recommendation process.
Okay. And just for a clarification, David, the entire property is going to have an R4 zoning rather than a split R4 and R2? Or is it going to be a split?
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, it would be a consistent R4 zone.
Okay. And the R4, being an R4 zone, the uses for that do not include any commercial uses. Is that correct in our zoning bylaw?
Through the mayor, as it is right now, yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
So the allowance of the commercial unit in the apartment building, would that have to have a separate amendment?
Schultz?
Through the mayor, yes, we'd have to include that in the final draft of the bylaw.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Councilor. Councilor Emery?
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the presenter. I just, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask about affordable housing. We all hear the word affordable passed around a lot, and I heard it, I think, twice tonight. I think once was through you, Councillor Bruno. Yeah. But I would like to understand if you've made any consideration for affordable housing, and if you have, what is the definition of affordable housing that you're using?
Mr. Thompson?
Through the chair, the definition that would be used would be the provinces, which is the 30th, 60th percentile of income based off of rental and ownership. At the moment, none of the units that we're proposing would adhere to that definition strictly. However, we've provided a pretty diverse range of housing, and we've made specific accommodations to allow for accessory dwelling units in this type of tenure. So they would be more attainable in nature. If the owner, for instance, the apartment building wishes to do affordable housing, there are some grant opportunities, I believe, that are available through agencies like CMHC, which could be explored. I'm not that familiar with them, so at the moment there are no affordable units that would strictly meet the definition.
Okay, thank you. So there's no real effort going into providing affordable housing, but there is a possibility you may be looking at something in the future with the apartment building only. Would that be fair to say?
Through the chair, that would be fair to say. There is a concerted effort to provide more attainable housing, and I believe council is aware how these projects have to pencil out, otherwise shovels aren't going to go in the ground. That being said, the units are inherently small. I shouldn't say they're small. The accessory dwelling units would be limited by a flat size as opposed to provision, which offers that ceiling. And yeah, so I hope that answers the question.
Councilor?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to be clear on it because I don't want to have people feel that they've been misled. Say it straight at the beginning and we're all on the same page. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Baggett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a comment for the presenter. I really like your conceptual building designs. They look really sharp, and I think that whole area is going to look, people will be knocking on their door to get in there because it's great looking, and design is very well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Claylough.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the presenter. I'm in favor with what Councillor Bagu said. I wanted to say it looks like a wonderful proposal. And if I understand what you're saying correctly, when you're looking at these buildings where they can put a home-based building or business in the base, that's really something that this next generation is looking to do. A lot of them want home-based businesses. So I think that will allow some affordability to this area. But overall, I think it looks like a wonderful project. I'd like to thank you for bringing it to the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any further questions? Great. Mr. Schultz?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Before opening the meeting to the public, I'd like to read the following statements. If a person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the City of Port Colborne before a decision on the proposed draft plan of condominium and or zoning bylaw amendment is passed by council, the person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision of the City of Port Colborne Council to the Ontario Land Tribunal. And further, if a person or public body does not make an oral submission at a public meeting or make written submissions to the City of Port Colborne before a decision on the proposed draft plan of condominium and or zoning bylaw amendments is passed by council, the person or public body may not be added as a party to the hearing of an appeal before the Ontario Land Tribunal unless, in the opinion of the tribunal, there are reasonable grounds to do so. To any interested members of the public, if you'd like to receive any future notices regarding these applications, you can contact me at david.schultz@portcolborne.ca. Nicole, I'm not sure if you could pull up the final slide of the my presentation.
It's there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, thank you. Look at that. So my contact information is on the screen, or I can be reached at 905-835-2900, extension 202. And further, for any members in attendance, members of the public in attendance today, there are sign-in sheets at the back of the room on the table. I'll just point in the general direction. Just please make sure you're signing the correct sheet when you're putting your name and address on there. Thank you. At this time, Your Worship, I'd like to invite any members of the public who wish to speak to the applications to do so.
Okay, perfect. If, Mr. Thompson, if we can get you to sit at the front chair here in case there's any further questions after the delegates come from council, then you'll still be available. Perfect, thank you. At this time, we have one in-person delegation and one virtual delegation. I'm going to call on Mr. Brian Cantor at this time. Just come up to the podium. There's a red button on the speaker there, and just state your full name and address. Thanks, Brian. And welcome.
We're good?
All set.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor, councillors, for hearing me. My name is Brian Cantor. I live at 30 Snyder Street in Port Colborne. I've got a couple of questions and concerns. So here we go. I'd like to start by saying that we had the opportunity at the previous meet and greet information session to voice our concerns about the proposed development. And looking at the new plan, our concerns and issues were considered as the overall plan has been modified by moving the apartment building closer to Elm Street. However, the previously proposed apartment building was only 3 stories. The current proposed apartment building has now doubled in size to 6 stories. Since the predominant land use in the neighborhood is low-density residential with many single-story homes, the proposed 6-story apartment building would have a negative impact on our low-density residential neighborhood. The loss of privacy and enjoyment of people's backyards will be impacted. The overall mass form will be significantly greater than the surrounding low-density neighborhood. Given that this is an established low-density residential neighborhood, a 6-story apartment building is not in keeping with the characteristics of the neighborhood. We feel strongly that We feel strongly that a fair compromise would be a 3-story apartment building in the same location as the proposed 6-story apartment building. This would help mitigate the privacy concerns and would be more in keeping with the existing established low-density neighborhood. So that was my first point. Next, with the increased total number of dwellings from the previously proposed plan of 48 dwelling units to a revised plan with 71 proposed units, will the current wastewater infrastructure be capable of handling the increased volume of wastewater? So by comparison, I took a look at the neighborhood, and 71 dwellings is the equivalent to 4 blocks in our existing neighborhood. We have lived in our house for 33 years and have never had a sewer backup issue. And we are concerned about the possibility of it happening with the increased demand on the infrastructure. The next point is, with Port Colborne having bedrock so close to the surface, and with the probable use of jackhammers and other means of removing bedrock, along with all the other heavy construction equipment used during the construction process, there is a high potential for damage to our homes in the neighborhood and other structures. Personally, our basement has no leaks, and I'd like to know what measures are going to be put in place if there are any repairs or repairs needed or to damages done to our houses and structures due to the construction of this development. The next point I'd like to make is, with a development of this size, what is the time frame from beginning to completion? With the development being surrounded by existing neighborhoods, there will be considerable disruption to our personal lives during the construction. And also, what are the plans for snow storage and removal? We have concerns that of the probability of flooding, the possibility of flooding in our backyards due to the blocked catch basins during the spring thaw. And those are all my points.
Great, thanks, Mr. Cannon.
You're welcome.
Council, before I go to staff, any questions to the presenter? Great. Mr. Schultz, are there any of those questions the presenter had? Can you give some general information on it? Because I know every development's a little bit different, but there are some similarities between.
Certainly I can touch on a few, Mr. Mayor, through you to the presenter. The application, with the application, there was a functional servicing report submitted that does address, or I wouldn't say address, but it takes a look at the existing services, and it has determined that the services are adequate. I can allow the applicant to touch on that further, but like council brought up afterwards, we can take a look at that further to ensure that the accessory dwelling units are captured in that as well, to ensure that the services are adequate. I think a number of your concerns will be addressed prior to the site plan being finalized, but I think that servicing one for sure is a major one and will be taken a look at.
And road construction, we all know that in Port Colborne, because of the rock, they do have to whole ram through that. How would that be handled normally through engineering?
I would defer to the applicant on that. I know they did do a geotechnical study for the area to evaluate the bedrock in the area. And then when the services are installed, there will likely be whole ramming that's required. Any issues that come up with that would be between the property owners nearby and the developer to address.
Okay. Councillor?
If I could, I'd just like to tuck that back into your final report. So maybe first on the issue of the servicing. So you're going to come back and talk about what the extra capacity may be over and above 71. At that time, to Mr. Canner's report, will there be an engineering report attached that speaks to the total amount of units maximum and that the services can handle it, sorry?
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, yes, we can ensure that that's included as part of the final recommendation report.
Thank you. And one last thing, Mr. Mayor, through you to the developer's agent. With respect to hole ramming and blasting. I know when we built apartment buildings here, there's been a site assessment of the neighborhood homes, pictures taken, a company that comes in and marks whether there's any cracks and foundations and that, and then there's a photograph in time, if you will, to that. Will your developer be undertaking that for the servicing, given the rock profile?
Mr. Thompson?
Through the chair. So with the geotechnical assessment and the borehole log, one of the ways we laid out the underground network of pipes was in keeping with trying to minimize deep excavation and jackhammering. The engineer of the firm, I don't want to say the wrong thing because I'm not really qualified to speak too much to the civil stuff, but we're quite confident that that can be avoided, and if it has to be done, it's very calibrated and minimal. Like specifically the southeastern portion of the site had the shallowest area of bedrock, and that actually was well for the apartment building because the apartment building doesn't have underground. So it's really just the foundation breaking the frost line and bearing on bedrock, which is actually ideal. But I believe my client would be okay with the precondition survey of the neighborhood to accommodate any concerns of the adjacent homeowners and damage to their properties.
Councillor?
So I agree it is unfair for you as the planner to comment on those engineering items and that, but so when the final report comes back, will you be able to bring with that information forward after speaking to the owner?
Mr. Thompson?
Through the chair, we can follow up with staff through correspondence as to the openness to the precondition survey. I don't suspect it's going to be an issue at all, something that could get ratified through the site plan agreement quite easily. And on the issue of sewage capacity and that, what has been done, and planning staff has mentioned it, is there's a preliminary functional servicing report that's been done that speaks to the general capacity of the city's network in handling the development. As part of the site plan control application, we'd be doing a stormwater management report that goes into a lot more detailed calculation that would determine the size of the underground tank for handling rainwater, among other things. So there is more work that needs to be done, but the preliminary functional servicing report didn't yield any consequentially adverse objections from engineering staff at the city.
I was referring though to the blasting and hole ramming. Could you bring us back an answer with that at the final report stage?
Through the chair, quickly before David may be able to answer that, but I do not know exactly how much detail we can confirm as to if blasting will be required until we actually start excavating. But Glenn Barr, the engineer at our office, last we had chatted, he was quite confident that that can be avoided with the arrangement of the roads and where the shallow parts of bedrock were. But planning staff, I imagine, would bring that in the recommendation report.
Yeah, there is no blasting, Councillor. It's only hole ramming.
Right.
We don't allow blasting.
We were kids.
Yeah.
Just to come back with it, if I could, with an undertaking that if it's needed, I understand you can't comment on the geotech and it might not be exactly right when you actually get into the ground, but I just think there's some assurance, I should say, that the neighborhood would want on that. And certainly we've had that with other buildings in Port Colborne. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schultz, you'll take that as advisement?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, yes.
Great, thank you. Councillor Bodnar?
Thank you. Through you to David, I guess. David, the presenter was asking about possible flooding in the spring with snow buildup and everything. Would there be a requirement for, when you look at the plans, there's a whole lot of area to stage snow on there. Would they be required to remove snow, like take it off site if we have a winter that just continually keeps building up? How would that be handled, or can it even be put in site plan control or something?
Mr. Schultz?
Yeah, through the mayor, we can put a condition in the site plan control that is taken into account if necessary. Typically, snow removal on private property is handled by the private property owner, which would be the condominium corporation in this case. So it would be up to them to address that when that snowfall event does happen.
Councillor?
But just to follow up, so would the city be able to say you got too much snow on there if it's right against the fence and, you know, it's either blocking the drains they're putting in for the neighbors? Is there something that we can do? I know they're supposed to do it, but I might feel better if we had some kind of a, you gotta do it. You know, if it got built up and there was a problem with the neighbors. Is that something you can consider in site plan?
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, we can definitely explore that. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you tonight, but we can take a look at that prior to the final report.
All set, Councillor? Great, thanks. Councillor Borgard?
Through your worship to either David or Mr. Thompson. So the resident made a comment regarding the high density aspect of this neighborhood, this proposed development, in an established low density neighborhood. Can you provide a response to him on that?
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, I could provide a brief response on that. The city's urban residential policies, where this situates in our official plan, does encourage higher density developments along arterial roads. Elm Street is an arterial road under the official plan transportation schedule. So we do encourage higher densities on those road types, provided they meet the specific density range.
Councillor, all set? Great, thank you. Councillor Bagan?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Mr. Thompson. There was a question raised, I know Councillor Bruno mentioned probably built in stages. Is there some sort of time frame for the whole, if everything went properly, for everything to be built in this development, are we talking 1 year, 2 years? In a perfect world, which it's an unfair question, I know that.
Mr. Thompson?
Through the chair. The best case is a shovel could go in the ground for primary servicing next year, assuming the site plan control, well, the zoning gets approved, no appeals, site plan control process goes through relatively unhampered from with the city. Primary servicing could occur, and then building permits issued shortly thereafter once certificates from Director of Public Works have been issued in accordance with the site plan agreement. The ground-oriented housing, again, it really depends on the capacity of the builder. And unfortunately, I can't quite predict the future, and I do not know if some of the blocks or lots would get parceled out to other builders. That's actually one of the reasons that we are proposing a neighborhood design code for this development, because it's something that both the owner and Better Neighborhoods consulting firm, we'd like to see the design vision followed through to the end, even if the property changes hands, and I imagine council would as well. So I don't know exactly how long it would take, and again, the apartment building is something that would likely be one of the last things to occur.
Councillor?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Great, thank you. Further questions regarding the presenters' questions and comments? Seeing none? Thanks, Mr. Cantor.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Next, we have our virtual delegation, which is Mike Horsley. He's in. Good evening, Mike. How are you?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. If we get you just state your full name and address for us.
Yes, hi, good evening. Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Council. My name is Mike Horsley, and I'm here tonight representing Sylvie Cantor, who resides at 30 Snyder Street in Port Colborne, which is directly abutting the south side of the proposed development.
Okay.
We had an opportunity, sorry?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. We had an opportunity to review the previous development proposal at the public information meeting. There are several questions and concerns regarding this proposed development, which I'd like to speak to. Firstly, I'll just go through the questions similar to what Brian Cantor did. Firstly, is the site plan approval delegated to city staff, or does council approve it?
Mr. Schultz?
Number two.
Well, I'll have Mr. Schultz answer that now for you.
Okay. Through the mayor, the site plan approval process is delegated to staff. And I will just further touch on, under new provincial Bill 109, City Council is required to delegate site plan approval to staff and cannot take that back.
Okay, go ahead, Mike.
Thank you. Yep, thanks. As part of the last meeting, we were very surprised that the revised development is now a 6-story in height and not just 3-story as previously proposed. Does the city have zoning requirements for fencing adjacent to residential properties to ensure adequate screening and developments in this case?
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor to the presenter and council, we don't have any explicit requirements, I'd say, but through the site plan process, we do look for, whenever there's a change in density or development type, we do look for fencing to be included. So that will be something we will be looking for through the site plan process.
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, thank you. Will the city require a landscape plan prepared and stamped by a landscape architect as part of the approved development plans of the site plan control agreement?
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, yes.
Go ahead, Mike.
Will the city require a photometric plan showing all on-site lighting as part of the approved development plans and as part of the site plan control agreement?
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor to the presenter, yes.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you. Will the private street being proposed be designated as a fire route, which will obviously then restrict all on-site parking throughout the development?
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor to the presenter, that will have to be looked at by our fire prevention officer. I know he did meet with staff previously and the applicant to address that, so that will be something that is addressed through the site plan process.
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay. We would request a special condition in the site plan control agreement stating that all on-site lighting be shielded and or directed away from adjacent properties.
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, yes, that's no problem. Staff does include that in most site plan agreements currently, so that will be something we look for in this one as well.
Okay, Mike.
Perfect. Thank you. Would also request that a closed board fence be required to be shown on the site plan along the rear property line of 30 Snyder Street as well as all along the southern property line.
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, we can certainly take a look at fencing through the site plan process.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you. Does the city require a designated loading area for the apartment building? I noticed there was a lay-by. I know some cities have actually a designated loading area.
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, to my knowledge, the city doesn't have any requirements for loading areas.
Mike?
Also, continue on the loading area. Does the city have any zoning requirements for a loading area for the garbage pickups where it doesn't actually block the lanes?
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, waste collection is reviewed by the Niagara region through the site plan process. If waste collection isn't possible through the regional waste collection policies, then waste collection is to be handled by a private waste collection company. Those will be addressed through the future site plan approval process.
Okay. Mike?
Okay, correct. I did notice that they were proposing MOLOC, so I'm guessing it's going to be private, and I didn't see any loading area for the MOLOC system. The other question here is, I know there's been some discussion about timeframes for this development. Is there going to be a phasing plan that's included in the site plan control agreement? And what is the time frame to complete the site plan? Because most site plan control agreements have a time frame that they have to be completed by.
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor to the presenter, That is correct. I believe we do have a standard clause in our site plan agreements that requires, I believe it requires construction to be started on the development, not necessarily completed. I think that time frame is 2 years. But certainly we can look at phasing as well if the applicant would like to phase the development. That can be something that is included as part of the site plan agreement schedules.
Mike?
Okay, thank you. Also, it's been brought up a few times here about the snow removal. And I was wondering, does the city have any actual zoning requirements for snow storage? I know some municipalities actually have a percentage of the area set aside for actually storing the snow. This development is pretty tight. If you look at some of the laneways, they're 3 meters wide, which is, just a little bigger than a standard parking spot. And then, the curbing is right up against, the fencing. The use of rear garages, somebody opens up their garage, they got to push the snow somewhere. So I can see snow storage, if it was a winter like last winter or in other winters, this snow storage is definitely going to be an issue on site. And like most businesses, being the condo corporation, they're going to tender it out to snowplow removal, which will, like everyone else, they'll probably go with the cheapest possible. So unless there's some sort of clause in the site plan control agreement, I can see where the snow removal is going to be an issue.
Schultz?
Through the mayor, the city doesn't have any current zoning provisions that would require the inclusion for snow storage areas or anything like that. However, that is, as I mentioned to Councillor Bodner, we can explore what we can and can't include in the site plan agreement to ensure that snow removal doesn't become a concern.
Mike?
Okay, thank you. I guess in closing, I would just like to point out that we all understand provincial policy statements and regional official plan, and everyone's encouraging intensification. But I just want to point out, it is still up to the local council to ensure that the proposed development is actually compatible and doesn't negatively impact the existing established, and that's the key word, established low-density residential neighborhood. Basically, meaning not all proposed developments are appropriate. I would respectfully request that council actually look at the existing neighborhood and envision, the 6-story apartment building being located in the middle of an established low-density residential neighborhood. It's one thing to look at it on a plan, and we're all for development and intensifying and moving forward. But envision at the corner of Elm Street and Main Street, the old shoe factory, I believe it was, and this building is potentially going to be higher than this. That building was built back probably, I'm not sure when. There probably wasn't even any zoning requirements. So, when you sit there walking on the sidewalk and you're looking straight up, 6 stories straight up, and everything else around that area is single-story residential. I mean, there's a few 2-story houses. It is quite a development for height along, even though it is an arterial road. So I just want to close off by saying that and really take a look at it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll just see if there's any questions to the presenter. Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Horsley. We really appreciate it. David?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One final comment here. If you wish to be notified of the approval of the draft plan of condominium and or zoning bylaw amendment, you must make a written request to the clerk. Only those persons and public bodies that give the clerk a written request for the notice of adoption and passing of a zoning bylaw amendment will be given notice. The proposed draft plan of condominium and zoning bylaw amendment recommendation report will return to a future council meeting. This concludes my portion of the public meeting. I will now turn the meeting back to you, Mayor Steele, to close the public portion of the meeting and receive the report for information.
Great, thank you, Mr. Schultz. So, Council, we have a recommendation that Development and Legislative Services Planning Division Report 2022-213 be received for information. Could I have Councilors Bruno and Danch move that? Any further questions? All in favor? And that's carried. Thank you. So our next is item 4.2, public meeting report for proposed draft subdivision and zoning bylaw amendment for Northland Estates. Mr. Schultz.
Thank you, Mayor Steele. The purpose of this meeting is pursuant to sections 34 and 51 of the Planning Act and to consider a draft plan of subdivision and zoning bylaw amendment application submitted by the applicant Matt Kernahan of Upper Canada Consultants on behalf of the owner 2600261 Ontario Inc. for the lands known as Northland Estates, legally known as Concession 2 on part of Lot 31, Concession 2 part of Lot 31 on Registered Plan 59R 12021, and parts 1 and 2, and concession 2 part lot 31 on plan 59R 11866 and parts 2 to 5. The zoning bylaw amendment proposes to amend the zoning bylaw 6575-3018 to rezone the subject lands from third density residential, residential development and environmental conservation to a site-specific mixed-use zone, environmental conservation, public and park zone, and a site-specific third density residential zone. This site-specific mixed-use zone is being sought to permit a maximum height of 14 meters for residential and non-residential buildings. The site-specific third density residential zone is being sought to permit a minimum lot area of 180 square meters and a minimum interior side yard of 1.5 meters for townhouse dwellings, and a minimum lot area of 327 square meters for detached dwellings. The draft plan of subdivision proposes to divide the subject lands into 122 lots for single detached dwellings, 10 blocks for 50 street townhouse dwellings, 1 mixed-use commercial and residential block, a park, and 1 block for stormwater management facility, and a block for environmental conservation. Notice of the public meeting was administered in accordance with Section 34 and 51 of the Planning Act as amended and Ontario Regulations 544/06 and 545/06. Notice of public meeting was circulated on August 31st, 2022 to internal departments and agencies. Notice was also circulated via regular mail to property owners within 120 meters on August 30th, 2022. Meeting details have been provided along with the council agenda on the city's website and under current applications. As of the date of this meeting, staff has received comments from the following commenting departments and agencies. From the drainage superintendent, no objection to the proposed application at this time. Further comments may follow once the grading plans are presented. From the bylaw enforcement division, no comments at this time. Further comments may follow when a detailed fence, tree, and landscape plans are available. From the fire department will need to see the finished travel road width and all turning radii to ensure the correct evaluation of the development. And noted this can be addressed prior to the application's consideration by council. From Enbridge, no objection to the proposed application. However, Enbridge reserves the right to amend or remove development conditions. From Hydro One, no comments or concerns at this time. From the Niagara region, at this time, Regional Planning and Development Services staff do not consider the proposed draft plan of subdivision and zoning bylaw amendment applications to be consistent with the PPS or conform to the growth plan and regional official plan, as an EIS addendum is required to confirm the proposal will not have significant negative impacts on the region's core natural heritage system. The requested EIS addendum will impact the draft plan and updated studies, being the planning justification report, noise study, servicing reports, stormwater management report, and those will be required to support a revised proposal. From the engineering department, engineering staff are completing a technical review of the submission materials that will be circulated to the applicant. It is expected that the majority of the comments will be able to be addressed prior to council's consideration of the draft plan and zoning bylaw amendment or through conditions of draft approval. The procedure to be followed this evening will be to present Development and Legislative Services Report 2022-215, pass the meeting to the applicant to provide a presentation, hear any comments of questions of clarification from council to the applicant or staff, open the meeting to the public for comments, and announce the requirements under the Planning Act for written notice of passage of the proposed draft plan of subdivision and zoning bylaw amendment. At this time, Your Worship, I'd like to present Development and Legislative Services Report, Public Hearing Report 2022-215. Next slide, please. The areas surrounding the subject lands are predominantly low-density residential uses. A commercial plaza exists to the south. The surrounding zoning varies from first-density residential to third-density residential and commercial plaza to the south. Next slide, please. The City of Port Colborne official plan designates the subject property as urban residential. Land uses in the urban residential designation include residential, neighborhood commercial, and community facilities and institutional uses. Residential uses such as the proposed development are proposed in the urban residential designation, and the official plan designation is not proposed to be changed as a result of this application. The official plan also indicates that the land is in a designated greenfield area, meaning the development is required to meet a density target of at least 50 people and jobs per hectare. The application will be evaluated against policies surrounding designated greenfield areas, as well as the general policies of the urban residential designation. Next slide, please. The proposed zoning bylaw amendment proposes to amend zoning bylaw 6575/3018 to rezone the lands from third density residential development, and environmental conservation to a site-specific mixed-use zone, environmental conservation, public and park, and a site-specific third-density residential zone. As mentioned, the special provisions of the mixed-use zone proposes to allow a maximum height of 14 meters for both residential and non-residential buildings, and the site-specific policies of the provisions of the third-density residential zone are to permit a minimum lot area of 180 square meters and a minimum, next slide please, and a minimum interior side yard of 1.5 meters for street townhouse dwellings, and a minimum lot area of 327 square meters for detached dwellings. Next slide please. Finally, as mentioned previously, the draft plan of subdivision will divide the land into 122 lots for single detached dwellings, 10 blocks for 50 street townhouses, 1 mixed-use block, a park block, a stormwater management block, and an environmental conservation block. At this time, Your Worship, I'd like to pass the floor to the applicant, Matt Kernahan from Upper Canada Consultants, please.
Great, thanks, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Kernahan, welcome.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. My name is Matt Kernahan. I'm a planning manager with Upper Canada Consultants, and I'm here on behalf of the ownership group. I should mention, as you've probably noticed, there are a number of representatives of the ownership group here with me as well. So thanks for the opportunity. I do have a presentation that I'd like to make this evening, so if that could be brought up, I'd appreciate it. Thank you very much. So planning staff's already done a very good job of presenting this application, and I'm mindful of your time. I won't spend a lot of it this evening reiterating what David has presented, but I do have a couple of points I'd like to make. Next slide, please. So many of you are probably familiar with the subject property. It's a large parcel of land in the urban area behind the Canadian Tire. The site was historically used for agricultural purposes, but has sat fallow for a number of years. Being within the urban area, the site has access to full municipal services, including sanitary sewers, water mains, and has frontage on Northland Avenue. As you've heard, provincial and regional policies identify the site as a greenfield site, which are where the province and region both direct growth to occur. The city's official plan also identifies the site as favorable for residential and mixed-use development, which is what is being proposed through these applications. As you've heard, the proposal is consistent with the city's official plan. The city's current zoning bylaw also recognizes that the site will be developed for residential purposes. Neighborhood development zoning, which is typical of large undeveloped parcels of land, requires an amendment to the zoning prior to development, which is what is being applied for in this instance. Next slide, please. So just to provide council with a bit of history, this slide shows the plan of subdivision that was approved for the property until approximately 2015. As you can see, the approved plan covered the entirety of the property with residential and related development and did not preserve any land for environmental purposes. The previously approved plan included 149 lots for single detached dwellings and 3 apartment blocks. The old plan included a block to be set aside for stormwater management, which by our calculations was much too small. It also included a block to be set aside beside the Canadian Tire in much the same location as is currently proposed for a park. Next slide, please. This slide is a colorized version of the draft plan of subdivision that is before council this evening. The plan includes, as you've heard, 122 lots for single detached dwellings, which is slightly less than previously approved. The plan has been modernized to include street townhouses, which are now commonplace in residential development, as they provide a more affordable housing type, which is still individually owned. The plan includes less apartment dwellings than previously. Through consultation with the city's planning staff, it was determined that it would be preferable to include a mixed-use commercial and residential building at the corner of Northland and West Side Road, rather than strictly apartment buildings at this location. So approximately 50 apartment dwellings are proposed at this location, in addition to some commercial uses on the ground floor. A public park is proposed to be located behind the Canadian Tire in a location that is accessible from 2 streets. Immediately adjacent to the park, a stormwater management facility is proposed to handle and control runoff from the site before it is discharged to the extension of the Eagle Marsh drain. And last but not least, the biggest change to the plan is the amount of area that will be set aside as a natural area. The plan before council this evening proposed to preserve just over a third of the site, or nearly 6 hectares, 14 acres, for environmental protection. This area contains all of the environmental features that are regulated by the NPCA, including a locally significant wetland and its buffer, and all of the areas identified through the environmental impact study completed by our ecologist as being worthy of preservation. It also includes a significant area that does not currently include currently protected features that will actually be enhanced to a better natural state than it is currently. Next slide, please. This slide demonstrates the zoning that is proposed through the applications. All of the area where single detached and street townhouses are proposed will be rezoned to a site-specific R3, which permits both of these housing types. That's shown in yellow. The red area is proposed to be rezoned to a mixed-use zoning to permit a building with ground floor commercial and residential apartments on upper floors. The area shown in light green would be rezoned to an open space zone to permit the proposed park and stormwater management facility. And lastly, the darker green will be rezoned to environmental protection to preclude this area from development. The environmental protection zoning will not permit any dwelling or other buildings and will only permit environmental conservation uses. This area, as I mentioned, is approximately 14 acres in size. Next slide, please. So a number of detailed studies went into the preparation of this application before council. Firstly, as I mentioned, an environmental impact study was completed which analyzed the natural features that are present on site. The study made a recommendation for areas to protect and enhance, and these recommendations have been incorporated into the development plan. A water balance was also completed to ensure that the development would not negatively impact the wetlands. Upper Canada, my firm, undertook a functional servicing and stormwater management report to assess the capacity of municipal infrastructure to accommodate the development. The report concludes that there is existing capacity available in the sewer and water system and that stormwater can adequately be managed on site. Traffic impact assessment was completed to assess the impact of the development on area roads and intersections. That report concluded that the development would not result in any negative impacts to the transportation system and that no upgrades would be required as a consequence of the development. Lastly, a noise impact assessment was undertaken to assess the impacts of noise from the Port Colborne Mall and West Side Road on future residents. This study concluded that with the implementation of the recommended measures, no negative impacts would be realized. Next slide, please. So before I move on to questions, I just want to quickly address public and agency comments. To date, agency comments have, as you've heard, been very positive with no objections. A number of agencies have provided comments indicating that they only require typical conditions of approval. City engineering staff in the Niagara region have requested some additional information and indicated that they are willing to work with our team and planning staff in order to get their inquiries addressed. The owner and my team are committed to working collaboratively with the staff at the city and the region in order to address their inquiries and move this file forward. I'm confident that we will be able to do that in the next short while and get this application back before council for a decision. I should mention that Until today, there had been no public comments received, but I do recognize that there are some members of the public present in council chambers this evening, and I should mention that the development group is also committed to addressing the public comments as we move forward through this process. With that, I'll conclude and lend myself to any questions you might have.
Great, thank you, Mr. Kernahan. I'll start with Councillor Demery.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Mr. Kernahan. Thank you so much for the presentation, and I got to say, I really like the flow of the subdivision. It looks great on paper, and I'm sure that it will serve the people well. I do have two areas that I'd like to explore. One, this concerns me greatly. Maybe I'm just not reading the plan properly, but if there were a problem at the intersection of Street A and Northland Avenue, how would the rest of the people get out of that area if they had an emergency? If for any reason that that intersection was blocked and it was not able to be passed through, what would happen to the rest of the people?
Well, so I should mention that would block the primary access to the subdivision. Yeah. There is an opportunity. There are additional lands of the owner that connect directly to West Side Road that, should it be the advice of staff or council, we could investigate adding in an emergency access at that location.
Okay, well, I thank you for that, because personally, I wouldn't buy a home if I only had one way out if there were an emergency. I would want to make sure that there was something else there available to me. So for the safety of the public, I would hope that you would put something else in there. Because there are places where it could fit, obviously. So that was one question. The other one is the same question I asked to the other people about the question of affordability. What, if any, efforts have been made, just so that this informs the public as to what they can expect?
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Mayor, to the councillor, I'm going to give a similar answer to my colleague earlier. There will be no purpose-built affordable housing, which meets the definition of the province for affordable housing. But yet again, there is a wide variety of housing forms included in this development, including apartments, and it is the developer's intent to build that apartment building themselves, along with their development partner or their building partner. And the intention there is that it be a rental unit, not condominiumized. So that provides an even greater opportunity for affordable housing.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Bruno.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you, Mr. Kernahan. I guess one of the things that I noted is the region listing of what they see as a number of studies to come. And just to read a bit of the conclusion here for the benefit of the public and those watching. This time, the Regional Planning Development Services staff do not consider the proposed draft plan of subdivision and zoning bylaw amendment application to be consistent with the PPS or conform to the growth plan and ROP and EIS addendum is required. And just to skip over, the requested EIS addendum will impact the draft plan and updated studies, planning justification report, noise study, servicing report, stormwater management will be required to support a revised proposal. So I guess my question is jointly probably to Mr. Kernahan and to David, our planner. Are we not very much at a stage where there could be enough need to adjust the layout that we're back here for another public meeting? And to that end, through you to David, at what point how significant of a change does there have to be to this current draft plan proposed to warrant another public meeting? Because I just think from what I've read, we're quite a ways, perhaps, ahead of a final version. And what I don't want to see lost in this is that all of that happens. The requirement under the Planning Act is we've had the public meeting, and the thing comes back to council, and there's not this opportunity again for the public to comment if there's significant changes as a result of all these studies. So in your mind, is there a line when it becomes too much of a change and then we need another public meeting?
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor to Councillor Bruno, certainly that is a concern. I will just note for council, under the provisions of the Planning Act for specifically subdivision approvals, additional public meetings aren't required to be had for changes that are made. However, that still is the case for the zoning bylaw amendment that is going along with this. So certainly if there are changes to the zoning of the property that warrant another public meeting, then we can certainly have that. Further, if it's the request of council, if there are significant changes to the overall plan that another public meeting is warranted, we can certainly explore that when that time comes.
Councillor?
Thank you, Council.
Okay. Councillor Baggett?
Oh, did you want?
Oh, so, yeah, you want to?
I'm sorry, if you don't mind.
Please.
Yeah, through your worship, just, I think it's important that I point out, there is a difference of opinion between regional planning staff and our ecologist who's been completing studies like this for 35 years. That's not uncommon. It's in fact quite common to get back and forth comments between our specialized sub-consultants and the region, and I don't want to undermine the importance of a consultative process, because that's why we circulate them, is for their comments. But there are times when there's a disagreement. At this point in time, we received those comments relatively recently, within the last week to 10 days. So, right at the deadline, I believe. So we haven't had the opportunity to collaborate with the region as of yet and have that conversation, understand where they're coming from, help them understand where we're coming from. So I guess my submission to you is I have a lot of confidence in the ecologist that we've used here. He basically wrote the book on wetland evaluation, so but I don't want to undermine the region either. So we're early in the process. We're going to negotiate it through, and you know, staff has been extremely helpful to this point. You'll see by the date of our application in July, and we're already before you now. So you know, it's been a very collaborative and positive process, and I'm sure it will be moving forward. So I just wanted to put that to you. Thanks.
Thank you for your take on it.
Great, thanks. Councillor Baggett?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You mentioned a little bit of past history that it was approved, including the wetlands area. It was approved by who? The 2015 council?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, my involvement on this application only spans about a year to 16 months. And in fact, the current ownership group purchased it following the lapse of development, the lapse of that approval. So we don't have a great picture on history, and I'm not sure if David does either, but presumably council, as the approval authority on draft plan of subdivisions, would have approved that former draft plan of subdivision. Or it may have been the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, depending on where in time it was initially approved. But it wasn't approved in 2015, it actually ceased to be approved in 2015.
Mr. Schultz, a little history for the councillor?
Through the mayor to council and the presenter, I believe, and take this with a grain of salt, I think it was 2002 that it was originally approved. And over the years, as council is aware, a number of extensions have come in to keep that approval going. And I think in the 2015 point, the developer at that time just walked away from it, from what I can see. I don't believe that any request for extension came in at that time to ask for further extensions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think the environmental rules have changed since 2002 quite a bit now, so it's going more forward towards protection of the wetland areas. One comment I'd like to make to the presenter. Past presenter did a neighbor meeting beforehand, coming to council and that, and I really thought that was a great idea, and I sort of wish you guys would have done it also. Maybe it was Eric's job, I don't know. But we'll see. And just a comment here. I'm surprised the Niagara region comes down with, I think, a heavy hammer on noise studies and that, and they're talking about the lift truck at Canadian Tire, the air pump at Canadian Tire, like, come on. I go there all the time and that air pump's not even working half the time, you know? And the lift truck is only, it's seasonal mostly and during the daytime, so. I just wondered, is there a process to appeal some Niagara regional stipulations, like further along the road? I don't know if Mr. Schultz knows that answer or not.
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, typically, well, whatever council decides to approve certainly can be appealed by the applicant or the Niagara region. It goes hand in hand. So there is that potential for sure, but it's tough to say kind of where that would end up at this point.
Okay, I'm good, Mr. Mayor, thank you.
Good. Any further questions? Seeing none, Mr. Schultz?
Thank you, Your Worship. Before opening the meeting to the public, I'd like to read the following. If a person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the City of Port Colborne before a decision on the proposed draft plan of subdivision and or zoning bylaw amendment is passed by council, the person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision of the City of Port Colborne Council to the Ontario Land Tribunal. And further, if a person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the City of Port Colborne before a decision on the proposed draft plan of subdivision and or zoning bylaw amendment is passed by council, the person or public body may not be added as a party to the hearing of the appeal before the Ontario Land Tribunal unless, in the opinion of the tribunal, there are reasonable grounds to do so. As I mentioned to any members of the public in attendance, if you'd like to receive future notices regarding these applications, you can contact myself on the screen up there, or you can also sign in on the sheet at the back of the room. At this time, Your Worship, I'd like to invite any members of the public who wish to speak to the application.
Great, thanks, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Carnahan, if you want to just sit up here in case there's more questions from council once the public speaks. We have 2, 4, 5 in-person delegations and 1 virtual delegation. I'm going to call on Amy Schilstra.
At this point, I have nothing to.
Nothing to say? Okay, thank you. Ron Reines? Look, is Ron? State your full name and address, Ron, please. Welcome.
Thank you, Your Worship. My name is Ron Reines. I reside at 29 Bartok in Port Colborne, and I'm here on behalf of myself and some of my neighboring property owners. So, yeah, I really do not want to be here today. As I sincerely want to see Port Colborne grow, prosper, and development, and really this development does in fact contribute to that. However, council may recall that approximately a year ago, I wrote to the council on behalf of the Bartok Crescent neighborhood expressing concern about basement flooding due to wet weather inflows and infiltration into the sanitary sewer system and inadequate pumping station capacity. In that letter, I addressed the fact that the city has done very little to address this concern for 30 years. I stated in that letter, quote, "In the meantime, the City of Port Colborne has continued to approve development in the Omer pumping station catchment area, knowing that there is inadequate capacity in its sanitary systems, and by doing so, seriously exacerbating the basement flooding problem for the Bartok Avenue residents. To Council's credit, earlier this year, you did approve a multi-pronged strategy to begin to address this long-standing problem. I'd like to specifically thank you, Mr. Mayor, Councillor Bruno, and the Public Works staff for their efforts and for convening a meeting with the region, as this involves both the city and the region. However, I'm not clear as to how much progress has been made. The city website does not include the status of any of the projects to be undertaken in 2022. So let me now turn to the application before you. The region of Niagara, in its comment, states, quote, "The proposed development is within the Steele Street sewage pumping station sewer shed. This sewer shed experiences significant inflow, infiltration, and may have limited capacity. The region will require a sanitary servicing report which outlines the timing/phasing of construction and the expected dry and wet weather sewage flows for the proposed development. Functional servicing report should review and provide comment on the Steele Street pumping station with regard to the additional flow. However, that doesn't tell the whole story. What the region does not say is that the Steel Street pumping station pumps all that wastewater that comes to it to the Omer Avenue pumping station, which then pumps it to the sewage treatment plant. It is the Omer pumping station that does not have the capacity during wet weather flows, backing sewage into the basements on Bartok. The correct description should be that the proposed development is within the Omer Avenue pumping station sewer shed. Now, this development proposes 222 residential units. Based on being told that there are approximately 975 residential units in the Omer catchment area, this development represents a 23% increase in the number of units contributing to the sanitary sewer system. Clearly, any servicing report must address the Omer Avenue catchment area, not just the Steel Street pumping station. Also, it should be noted that the Oxford pumping station at the north end of the city, in the north end of the city, also pumps sewage to the Steel Street pumping station, meaning that Omer takes both Steel Street and Oxford sub-catchment areas. The region is intending to increase the Oxford pumping capacity to accommodate future growth. Again, increasing capacity of the upstream pumping stations without addressing the Omer pumping station just exacerbates the problems on Bartok. So until there is an upgrade to the Omer Avenue pumping station to better handle wet weather flows, or perhaps there is a significant, proven, and sustainable reduction in the inflow/infiltration during storm events, we must object to any approval of this development. It's just premature. The Council is aware that the frequency and intensity of major storm events will likely increase based on what scientists are saying about climate change. The city must address its infrastructure deficiencies, both through capital investments and stringent, enforceable inflow infiltration reduction policy to enable it to better handle such events. Only when that happens can developments within this areas be approved. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Reines. Questions to the presenter? Councillor Bruno?
Thank you, and it may be a joint question to David. Ron, you've got significant background in planning, and now you've brought this forward. It was my understanding, and David, maybe you have to get back to us on engineering, but it was my understanding, I'd asked this question not about this development, but not the previous one tonight, but another development in Port Colborne. Does planning approve or potentially approve draft plans of subdivision that then need to be reviewed by the region and the city? And if the capacity at those plants or the piping to the plant are not suitable, is the draft plan could be passed but put on hold till the servicing is complete? That's the way I'd been told about this 16 months ago. I'm just wondering if you can confirm that, Ron, if you know whether a draft plan approval can still have an H on it based on engineering studies to come. And if those engineering studies prove that the development puts it into even more surplus, that the developer is to contribute towards that upgrade. Now, I just would like some clarification on that, if you can as a planner, but if not, if you can get back to us.
Mr. Schultz?
Yeah, I may have to, through you, Mr. Mayor, I may have to follow up on that. But typically the approval is given when we have a good understanding of what the development entails. And the approval should hypothetically be able to be followed through with in the next few years after that, right? So, but certainly we can follow up further on that to find that out.
Maybe I can help a little bit. There are draft plan conditions. Like I said, my beef is not with the developer at all. I really like this development, and it should proceed. So pumping station capacities can normally be accommodated through a condition on draft plan, and that has to be met before it can be lifted. Also, the zoning bylaw can have an H, a holding zone placed on it, that can only be lifted once everything has been addressed to the satisfaction of the municipality. But again, my issue is not so much with the developer as it is with the city. The developer can do his thing, but I don't think you can solve this problem unless you deal with your infiltration problem. And until you do that, you can't approve these types of developments, because you cause us a big problem, and now that you're aware of it, the city of Port Colborne becomes liable for that.
Yeah. And just further to that, Councillor, we do have a plan that came through Public Works last Thursday, or last Tuesday, I think it was, the meeting, which talked about the region as a whole, but it did break it down into municipalities. There is some major work to be done, as Ron has pointed out. So I'll get that to council. I'll get our engineering staff to put together something that hopefully they've received from the region, and if not, they can contact their counterparts at the region, at least get it down to us and there is some timelines on those. Some of them are further out than we have asked for, and we've been told by senior staff that those timelines were put in by the consultant, yet regional staff is putting them in sooner. So and that's in different areas of the city. So we'll get that back, because it could answer a lot of questions that Mr. Reines has brought up this evening.
Really here for tonight, but to Mr. Reines's point, the other thing was predecessor director of engineering, the upgrades that Darlene is working on, the things that are being worked on and that Ron's aware of, if we could get that package together, because that was supposed to come to us so I could pass it on, but I know it's stuck, or it got stuck in the reorg there, if we could have that too. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Madam Clerk, you'll remind Public Works to get that back to the council, just to give us an update. Thanks. Okay, further questions? Any further questions? Thanks, Ron. Appreciate it. Next up is Matthew Wynot.
I have nothing right now.
Great, thank you. Casey Towns?
I don't think I have anything right now.
Okay.
But we were all under the impression that we had to speak, otherwise our voices would not be heard at
No.
any given time.
No.
That's why we all signed up.
No, that's fine, yeah. No, that's okay. Just make sure you sign the sheets at the back. I mean, although you are in as a delegate, it's always good to do that. Great, thanks, Casey. Daryl Bisnet? Okay, thanks, Daryl. And we do have one virtual delegation?
Yes, I just have some technical issues. So just
Okay.
hopefully something that can be addressed.
And as you guys will hear, anytime you have a question, Mr. Schultz's information will be there. You can get a hold of him at any time. Perfect, thank you. Hi, Mr. Hall, how are you? Just turn your mute off.
All right, I'm well, thank you.
Good.
I'm speaking on behalf of my mother, who's been living on Coronation Drive for just shy of 50 years and backs onto a farmland, so it's just adjacent to the development that's being proposed. And I had two questions. One was already dealt with about the Omer pumping station and capacity, but the second one is more about the Eagle Marsh drain, which is, I think, a necessary piece to the development, the proposal. If I'm not mistaken, that'll have to be, I guess, cleaned out, the existing ditch essentially at the back of the properties, moving along Coronation Drive and behind Merritt Parkway to connect to the Eagle Marsh drain. Is that correct?
Mr. Schultz?
Through the mayor, that is correct. I know the applicant has been working with the drainage superintendent at the city to fix those drainage concerns. So that will need to be addressed. So I hope that answers your question.
And I think there is some planned work on that drain that came to us in a report. It's been a while, but
Yeah, well, those properties tend to get quite a bit of water at the back, and without additional work done on the drain system, any development will probably add more water to the backyards of and possibly flooding to the homes themselves. That's the concern that I would have.
Yeah, Mr. Carnahan?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, to the commenter. We did petition the city to extend the Eagle Marsh drain, and they are in the process of doing Drainage Act improvements for the extension as well as the existing drain, and that's a study that's being led by the city's drainage superintendent. So I know there's an upcoming meeting on that on 28th, I believe. Detailed information will be available at that meeting, which is being advertised on the city's website.
Okay, great. Thanks. Go ahead, Randy.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. One last and sort of larger enveloping question would be the timeline of a proposal of this nature. To get the work done and get a subdivision like this in, I know there's many steps, but is it like a 5 years away plan, 3 years away plan? I don't even have a clue how long away would this development be in the process before it actually became a reality.
Mr. Carnahan?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, obviously, I'm not sure if you can see the gallery, but my client is very anxious to get on with this development. Typically, as you say, development happens in stages. Following draft plan approval, it usually takes about 1 year to start getting shovels into the ground. And then my anticipation is that the build out of the subdivision would be phased according to market demand for the houses. So impossible to predict just how quickly that phasing might go, but I can assure you that the intention is to move forward with starting construction on the primary services as soon as practicable following approval.
Okay.
If that answers my question, thank you.
Great, thanks, Randy. Any questions to Mr. Hall by council? See none? Great, good to see you again, Randy. Thank you. That's it. Back to Mr. Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One final comment here. If you wish to be notified of the approval of the draft plan of subdivision and/or zoning bylaw amendment, you must make a written request to the clerk. Only those persons in public bodies that give the clerk a written request for the notice of the adoption and passing of a zoning bylaw amendment or a draft plan of subdivision will be given notice. The proposed actually, I will just remind everyone again, there's a sign-in sheet at the back. If you can sign in there, then you'll be sure to get a notice of the decision. And the proposed draft plan of subdivision and zoning bylaw amendment recommendation report will return to council at a future date. That concludes my portion of the public meeting. I will now turn the meeting back to you, Mayor Steele, to close the public portion of the meeting and receive the report for information.
Great, thanks, Mr. Schultz. If I could have Councilors Califf and Bagu move that Development and Legislative Services Planning Division Report 2022-215 be received for information. Any questions? Seeing none, all in favor? That's carried unanimously. Great, and I just want to note that there was Councillor Beauregard's conflict with that, so he's not in the room. Thanks, Mr. Carnahan, and we thank the developers for coming out tonight, and we appreciate the public coming out and asking for information. And if, as I said earlier, if you need anything further, please get a hold of Mr. Schultz right here at City Hall. There are no procedural motions, no information items. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time we'll adjourn this meeting. Thank you.